Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. Today we'll delve into Jeff Buckley's life. His story started on November 17, 1966, in Anaheim, California. The world he was born into was already steeped in music. His father was Tim Buckley, a respected singer-songwriter known for his avant-garde folk and jazz influences, though Tim was mostly absent from Jeff's life. Jeff's mother, Mary Guibert, was the true grounding force of his early years. She also had a musical ear, but more than that, she had a steadfast commitment to nurturing her son's gifts. As a child, Jeff didn't get to see much of Tim. In fact, by the time Jeff was old enough to appreciate who his dad was, they'd already drifted apart. Tim Buckley himself died young, at the age of 28, due to a drug overdose, and Jeff was only 8 years old at the time. That early brush with loss of a father he hardly knew, but whose musical DNA ran deep, likely shaped Jeff's view of life and his own artistry. From a young age, Jeff knew that music wasn't just a hobby, it was a lifeline. Growing up in Southern California, Jeff developed a fascination for various sounds. He absorbed everything from Led Zeppelin to Nina Simone, from classical Indian music to the raw emotion of blues guitar. He was a sensitive kid. Friends recall he was shy, but lit up whenever the topic turned to songs, chords, and lyrics. Mary and her then-husband, Jeff's stepfather, introduced him to the guitar at an early age. By the time he was in his teens, Jeff was already playing music with a laser-like focus that caught everyone's attention. If someone asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Jeff answered without missing a beat, "A musician." That certainty guided him through the usual teenage confusion and gave him a drive that few others had. In his late teens, Jeff attended the Musicians Institute in Los Angeles, refining his guitar techniques and immersing himself in theory. But a classroom setting could only do so much for a restless soul. Sometime in his early 20s, he decided to move to New York City, believing the East Coast might offer new inspiration. It was an adventurous leap. Back then, finding a foothold in the New York scene as a young musician was tough. There were countless talented people chasing the same dream. Yet something about Jeff stood out immediately. His voice had a sweeping range that felt almost otherworldly, shifting from tender whispers to soaring wails in a single breath. He didn't sound like anyone else. He was also a gifted guitarist, equally adept at subtle chord voicings and dramatic electric riffs. Word of this remarkable performer spread quickly through the small key clubs in Manhattan's East Village. Performing in tiny venues like Cine, Jeff found an immediate and devoted following. His sets were raw, acoustic, and deeply intimate. He'd play covers of Edith Piaf or Led Zeppelin with the same heartfelt approach, as though he were unveiling secrets written straight into his DNA. By the time record executives started dropping in, they realized they'd stumbled on something special. In 1992, he performed at a tribute concert for his late father, Tim Buckley, which garnered him a wave of media attention. Suddenly, major labels were circling around, eager to secure this rising star. Eventually, Jeff signed with Columbia Records, feeling they were best aligned with his artistic vision. That decision set him on the path to creating the album that would define him. The creation of Grace began in earnest around 1993. The seeds were planted when Jeff teamed up with producer Andy Wallace, who had worked with acts like Nirvana on their groundbreaking records. Jeff entered the studio determined to explore every inch of his musical identity. He recorded with a rotating cast of musicians, creating a tapestry of sounds, haunting vocal melodies, atmospheric guitar textures, a little bit of old-school rock swagger, and hushed introspective moments that left you breathless. The album features original songs like Mojo Pin, Grace, and So Real, but it also contains some of the most evocative covers ever recorded. Lilac Wine and Corpus Christi Carol showcased how Jeff could take a classic, or a time-worn piece and make it entirely his own. Yet the track that would become a cultural phenomenon was Hallelujah. Leonard Cohen wrote it, but Jeff breathed into it a vulnerability and yearning that many feel remains unmatched. It's a tricky thing, covering someone else's masterpiece, but Jeff performed it with such intimacy that it felt as though he was singing it in a room with just one person listening. Critics went wild. Many predicted he'd be the next major voice in rock. Even some of the biggest names in music, Robert Plant, Paul McCartney, and Bob Dylan, expressed admiration for his voice and approach. Despite this growing respect from peers and critics, Grace didn't initially rocket to commercial success. It sold moderately and was appreciated primarily by a niche audience who recognized its brilliance. Jeff, however, was never driven by fame. He was more focused on staying true to the music, sometimes to the frustration of label executives who wanted a more mainstream direction. His live shows became legendary for their emotional intensity and free-flowing structure. Audiences never knew exactly what to expect. Jeff might perform a gorgeous rendition of a standard one moment and pivot to a thrashing guitar assault the next. The tension between his artistic integrity and the music industry's commercial demands began to weigh on him, but for a while, he maintained that delicate balance by leaning on his authenticity and sense of wonder. Yet his life wasn't just about the music. Jeff had a deeply thoughtful, almost poetic spirit. He liked to disappear into bookstores, reading everything from 19th century poetry to existential philosophy. Friends recall him discussing topics like mortality and the nature of creativity with a kind of gentle curiosity. Underneath his stage presence, though, was a sensitive soul who sometimes felt overwhelmed by the growing pressures around him. He was deeply aware of his father's legacy, how Tim's brilliance was cut short, and he wrestled with the idea of being compared to someone he barely knew. A part of him worried that he was following a similar path, though in a different era. It's said that he often questioned whether he deserved the attention he was getting and what it might mean for his future. If you watch old interviews, you'll see how he could be both playful and introspective, capable of joking around but also ready to dive into deep existential topics at the drop of a hat. In the mid-90s, Jeff embarked on extensive tours to promote Grace. These tours took him across the U.S., Europe, and parts of Asia, slowly but surely building a dedicated fan base. Critics lauded him, calling him one of the most promising singer-songwriters of the decade. Then came a turning point. After wrapping up the promotional cycle for Grace, Jeff grew frustrated with the idea of churning out a quick follow-up just to capitalize on buzz. He wanted time to craft something genuine, not a carbon copy of his first album's success. Columbia, while supportive, was also eager to see results. The tension between Jeff's meticulous creative process and the industry's hunger for the next big hit weighed on him, leading to occasional clashes and a sense of restlessness. He retreated to Memphis, Tennessee in early 1997 to work on material for what would have been his second album. Why Memphis? Jeff felt drawn to the city's musical heritage. Sun Studio, Elvis Presley, blues and gospel traditions. Something about Memphis seemed right for the next chapter of his story. He found a place to stay and tried to settle into a routine of nightly rehearsals and jam sessions, sometimes recording bits of new songs in the early hours. He'd walk around town, soak up the atmosphere, and let the city's history seep into his evolving sound. Friends recall him being in a reflective but hopeful mood. While some days he struggled with creative blocks, on others he was energized, inspired by the ghostly echoes of legends who once roamed the streets of Memphis. And then came the day that no one saw coming, May 29th, 1997. Jeff and a friend were waiting for the rest of his band to arrive for rehearsals. The evening was warm, and the Wolf River was beckoning like a quiet retreat from daily pressures. Known for his playful spontaneity, Jeff jumped into the water fully clothed, singing a few lines from Led Zeppelin's Whole Lotta Love, letting the moment carry him away. But the currents turned treacherous. A passing tugboat created waves that engulfed him, and he was pulled under. His friend, who was on shore, desperately tried to find any sign of him, but soon realized Jeff was gone. The ensuing days were fraught with anxiety searches and prayers, as those close to Jeff clung to the faint hope that he might have survived. On June 4th, 1997, his body was recovered, and the news rattled the music world like an earthquake. In an instant, Jeff Buckley went from a promising young artist on the cusp of something extraordinary to a tragic legend. The cause of death was ruled as accidental drowning. No drugs or alcohol were found in his system. Many fans couldn't help but see an eerie parallel to his father's untimely demise. Though Tim's story involved a drug overdose and not an accidental drowning, still, the sense of a generational tragedy remained. Here was a father and son, both strikingly talented, both gone too soon, each leaving behind a collection of music that would haunt listeners for decades. The tragedy cast a long shadow, intensifying Jeff's posthumous fame. As the news spread, tributes flowed from around the globe. Fellow musicians expressed profound loss. Artists like Chris Cornell and Jimmy Page spoke openly about Jeff's genius and the grief of losing such a vital soul. Fan vigils popped up in cities everywhere, with people gathering to play Jeff's songs in dimly lit bars or candlelit memorials. Older fans, some of whom had followed Tim Buckley's career years before, couldn't help but feel a profound heartbreak over the family's repeated misfortune. Even people who hadn't been avid fans before found themselves deeply moved by the personal tragedy. His mother, Mary, emerged as the caretaker of his legacy, eventually overseeing his archives and posthumous releases. You could hear a blend of pride and sorrow whenever she spoke of her son, grateful for the love he received but heartbroken at how short his life had been. Despite having only one complete studio album to his name, Jeff Buckley's influence continues to ripple through modern music. Young singer-songwriters often cite him as an inspiration, trying to capture even a fraction of the emotional intensity he brought to each performance. His vocal style, a sublime mixture of rock edge, soulful longing, and almost choir boy purity, broke boundaries. Before Jeff, few rock artists embraced a heady falsetto or wove such delicate textures into their work. After him, it became more common to hear male singers approach their range with that same fearless abandon. And of course, Hallelujah, once a relatively obscure Leonard Cohen track, has become a staple in films, television, and singing competitions, largely because Jeff's version opened the world's eyes to its hidden beauty. Indeed, many people today discover Jeff Buckley through that one song, and then dive deeper, discovering the depth of grace and the rough sketches he was working on for his second album. In modern American culture, Jeff is often upheld as the quintessential example of what could have been. He was that rare artist who could have shaped the direction of rock, soul, and alternative music for years to come. The posthumous releases, like Sketches for My Sweetheart the Drunk, gave us glimpses of where he might have headed musically. Some tracks are raw and unfinished, but they reveal a restless spirit forever pushing the boundaries of his art. Critics have gone back and reevaluated Grace, often placing it near the top of greatest album lists, even if it didn't get the recognition it deserved in the mid-90s. In a way, Jeff has become more revered now than he ever was in life. Beyond the albums and accolades, there are countless behind-the-scenes stories that highlight Jeff's compassionate and often whimsical nature. One friend recounted how Jeff would spend an entire afternoon calling various hospitals to locate an injured fan, just so he could wish them a speedy recovery. Another anecdote involves him sneaking into a fan's acoustic open mic set, unannounced, adding harmonies to one of his own covers. The stunned performer found himself singing alongside the original artist, forging a once-in-a-lifetime memory. That was Jeff's way. Unpredictable, gracious, and always deeply connected to his audience and those around him. He was never one to insist on VIP treatment or to put himself above others. He seemed genuinely curious about people's stories, their dreams, and how music fit into their lives. After his passing, tributes rolled in from fellow musicians and fans alike. Chris Cornell wrote a heartfelt dedication, "Wave Goodbye," capturing the collective sorrow of an entire generation that had lost an iconic voice. David Bowie once said that if he could only take one album to a desert island, it would be Grace. Bob Dylan, in one of his radio shows, praised Jeff's voice as one of those voices that are hard to believe you're hearing. Online communities, especially among older Western audiences who'd grown attached to the likes of Dylan, Joni Mitchell, and other seminal artists, embraced Jeff as a symbol of authentic artistry. They shared bootleg recordings, exchanged stories about his live shows, and mourned the fact they'd never get the follow-up album he so desperately wanted to create. In one particularly moving story, a fan recounted meeting Jeff at a small cafe in the East Village before he was famous. They struck up a conversation about music, and Jeff spontaneously took out his guitar and sang a snippet of "Lover You Should Have Come Over" just for her. According to this fan, the entire room fell silent, utterly spellbound by the sincerity pouring out of him. After he finished, Jeff smiled self-consciously, almost surprised at the hush he'd created, and then he went right back to sipping his coffee. That capacity to mesmerize yet remain humble sums up Jeff's spirit perfectly. It's a testament to how he never seemed fully aware of his own magnitude. All these years later, his absence remains a deep wound for those who were close to him, family, friends, and fellow musicians who saw firsthand the spark he carried. But it also stands as a poignant reminder of how fragile life can be. He was someone who lived intensely, loved deeply, and channeled every ounce of that fervor into his art. While it's bittersweet to consider his story, we can find solace in the idea that Grace and his other posthumous recordings exist like a time capsule, giving each new generation a chance to discover his brilliance. His mother continues to keep Jeff's memory alive, carefully curating unreleased demos and preserving his personal artifacts. She's spoken about how moving it is to watch young fans, born after Jeff's passing, fall in love with her son's voice. It's as if Jeff's spirit is still out there, touching people who never had the chance to see him perform live. People often debate what Jeff Buckley's career would look like if he had survived. Some imagine he would have gone into experimental territory, incorporating jazz, world music, or electronic elements into his rock foundation. Others believe he might have stepped away from the limelight altogether, as the pressures of fame and the inevitable comparisons to his father weighed heavily on him. We can't know, and that mystery is part of what keeps his legacy so alluring. The longing for more is almost baked into the experience of listening to his work. Each track feels like a glimpse of someone who left before he could fully share his story. Thank you for joining me in this look back on Jeff Buckley's life, the making of his incomparable album Grace, and the tragic way his journey ended. Whether you've been a fan since the 90s or you're just discovering him, I encourage you to revisit or dive into his songs with fresh ears. Let his voice remind you of the power music has to connect us, comfort us, and challenge us to feel something real. And if you have any special memories, maybe you saw him live, or a particular Jeff Buckley track got you through a tough time, please feel free to share them with others, because that's how his light keeps shining. We keep it alive by remembering, by listening, and by passing it forward to the next person in need of a little grace.